So I want to welcome everybody for participating, and we're really excited to tell you about one of our Eden pilot projects, and as was mentioned, Eden is the Extension Disaster Education Network. And this actual pilot project came out of our program area work group for community development within Eden. And so I want to introduce sort of myself. I am a community development educator with the University of Illinois Extension. And also on the webinar today, we'll have Bev Maltsberger from the University of Missouri Extension, Mike Gaffney from Washington State Extension, and also not being able to participate, but another key part of this pilot project was Ashley Mueller with the University of Nebraska Extension. So we did have 4 states participating with lots of guidance from Purdue as well. So if we want to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So as part of the program area work group on community development within Eden, we sort of decided that this development of the community organizations active in disasters kind of being facilitated by Extension staff was a good idea for multiple reasons. The first reason being that one of our key programming areas is participatory planning, and actually pulling together all of these various entities into what's necessary to have a good functioning COAD was sort of one of those things that in community development we're really good at, and we facilitate meetings all the time. The second reason is most of us within Extension receive some amount of our funding through our local counties, local states, and this program is sort of a value added. What can we do to help our local counties and governmental entities function a little bit better, especially in the realm of disasters? So Beth, if we could go on to the next screen. We also, in many of our counties and in many states, are one of the few large organizations that still maintain a presence. Here in Illinois, for example, we only have 27 units, but almost every county has an office staffed at least part-time. So we continue to have a presence in rural counties where many times, for a variety of reasons, a lot of other disaster agencies or people that we think about as having a role to play in disaster response and recovery can no longer afford to maintain that presence. So we are a constant in most of our rural counties. And then fourth, in a lot of our very rural counties, there are minimal emergency management staff or resources. And where there are emergency management staff, many times they are wearing so many different hats that it's very difficult for them to manage all of the functions that are necessary in terms of disaster response. And then if we move on to the next slide, we can look at who all was involved in this project. So obviously from each of our states, we had extension staff that were involved in sort of taking the lead. But we also worked with a lot of our local officials, including our emergency management directors, our county boards, those kinds of officials. Many times other like mayors, those kinds of officials who may have a role to play in disaster recovery. We also invited lots of not-for-profit entities within our states or within our regions that we were serving because we wanted to make sure that the conversation that we were tying in all of those people that have a role to play as well. We work directly with our state voluntary agency liaisons or the state VALs. Usually those are housed within the state emergency management agencies, and those are the people that work directly with the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, all of those disaster response agencies that we all think of. And then finally, We also worked directly with state VOAD members, which are the voluntary agencies active in disasters, including the Red Cross, including the Salvation Army, other entities that might be present. I know, as Bev will talk about probably in Missouri, they included Catholic Charities in one of their regions, those kinds of things. So those are the players that we brought together for this particular pilot project. And I'm going to turn it over to Bev to talk a little bit about how we structured this pilot.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. We started out with proposing this pilot project between Missouri and Illinois, and the word kind of got out, and pretty soon we received calls from Nebraska and Washington, and both Ashley and Mike were very interested in the project and wanted to see if we could expand it a little bit. So we were able to do that. So our two-state project became a four-state project rather quickly, involving, as I said, Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, and Washington. Next slide, please. So some of the goals of our project, first of all and foremost, we wanted to see if we could repeat using the manuals from Purdue and from Missouri to see if COADs could be developed in other states as well. As Carrie said earlier, this was a project of the Eden Community Development Program Area Work Group. The project was undertaken to test viability of facilitating development of rural COADs through Extension being the lead agency. And we feel we were successful in that. Extension's one of the few agencies that, as Carrie said, has that presence. So we have some trust, we have some ownership, we have belief in our communities. It's not someone else coming in. Throughout the project, we kind of had a dual focus. First, we're trying to assist the selected counties with development of their COADs, but also we're striving to identify best practices as well as challenges as Extension led the development process. So looking at how we would develop it and things that we could improve there. The final and overarching goal of the process was to develop guidance and materials for other Extension staff who would like to assist their counties in development of a COAD. And along those lines, we have put together documents on the process, materials and guidelines and technical resources that are available now online through Eden. Next slide. So what we're going to do next is we're going to review just some of the experiences and the status of the COADs that each of us have been working with. And we're going to start with Carrie. So she's going to tell us a little bit about how Illinois has organized that first COAD.
Thanks, Bev. Henderson County, Illinois is a very, very small county. It's a rural county of slightly less than 7,000, directly across the river from Burlington, Iowa. So it's sort of a disaster-prone community because of its proximity to the Mississippi River, and it also sort of has a large number of teeny tiny communities without a really large community within it. And so as we began working with Henderson County after the floods of 2008 here in Illinois, we recognized the lack of resources and the lack of knowledge in the realm of disaster. So they seemed like a really ripe county to be able to try to get a COAD started in. And so through this project, we spent a year, because our project actually began in January of 2015. We spent a year literally going through all of the steps of designing our COAD for a single rural county. And we built the process from the ground up using in large part the Missouri COAD manual as well as the Indiana VOAD manual. And through that process, we were able to have a local fiscal agent agreement in place with a not-for-profit. Bev will probably tell you why that's so important down the line. And then we did annexes, which in normal terminology are committees, but for some reason, every discipline must have its own terminology. So we have annexes for both donations, so that someone can help coordinate those donations as a disaster is occurring. We have an annex for public health, one for volunteer, one for education and training. Obviously, Extension is leading that one. We also have a long-term recovery committee. We have an agriculture annex, since it is such a rural community, and the Eden funds are directly tied to that, and so we were able to have the Farm Bureau be sort of the lead on that agriculture annex. We also chose to have a mental health annex and an emergency shelter annex. The emergency shelter annex, like in most places, is handled by the Red Cross in Henderson County. And we've been really, really lucky that most of the items that we have included in the annex have been relatively easy to draw upon, and people are really excited and willing to participate. We've gone on a schedule where we're trying to do 4 separate activities in a year. So this past year in March, we had a training on, for those of you extension professionals will appreciate this, on a Saturday morning we had a 4-hour training, and in a county of 7,000 we're able to get 25 officials and COAD members for that training, and they were so happy with it. They wanted to know what we're going to do next year, and that was basically sort of an overview of NIMS 7 and 800 for those of you who are familiar with the National Incident Management Framework, and they were very willing to learn all of that and go online later and take their test. We've also done a tabletop exercise with the scenario of a tornado hitting our local county fair, which is very near and dear to most of us extension professionals. And then coming up this fall, we are planning a functional exercise of a train derailment. And then in January, we will host our annual COAD meeting. So that's sort of in a nutshell what we've been doing in Henderson County. Luckily, we've not had any disasters that we've had to operationalize the COAD, but we work hand in hand with the emergency manager in Henderson County, and she is actually thrilled to have the COAD as a resource to lean upon. So now I'll turn it back over to Bev to talk about St. Joe.
Thanks, Carrie. I'd like to pick up on her final comment about the County Emergency Management Director. That person is so critical to the development of your COAD. It just will not happen and be successful without support of either that city or county emergency management director. We're very lucky in St. Joe because our county and city emergency management directors were so excited to get this going. St. Joe is located about 60 miles north of Kansas City, right on the Missouri River, so flooding is just second nature here. It happens a lot. Many of the regional agencies that serve all of Northwest Missouri and Northeast Kansas are located in St. Joseph, so we do have those folks to participate with us. We had a bit of an unusual start for our COAD in that you probably heard in 2011 that there was a lot of water released in St. Joe, and the area north of us was underwater for 4 months. So we actually started as a long-term recovery committee in 2011 and then backed into actually establishing our COAD in 2013, which that's not totally unusual. Sometimes that's just the way the COADs happen. Currently, we're focusing our COAD on the faith-based participation. As Carrie mentioned about funding, you really have to have some sort of a 501c3 to receive funds for your COAD and serve as your umbrella organization early on. Later on, you may want to develop your own 501c3, but it really gets you up and operational quick if you can have another 501c3 sponsor you to start with. And we do that through one of our local faith-based groups. That's one area that we're really focusing now, is bringing in additional faith-based partnerships. And we're also looking at doing volunteer training, because our emergency management director said, you know, when I need volunteers, I need them right away. So that's one of his priorities. So we are definitely supporting that. We also are doing quarterly trainings for our full COAD membership. After a while during Blue Sky, people kind of lose interest and attendance drops off. So we have gone to just the executive committee meeting on a monthly basis, and then quarterly we have the full, all members of the COAD come in for some sort of a training. And trainings that we have done in the past include looking at our emergency food provider and finding out what resources they have, how they can get food to a disaster site, just learning about that. We have also done a shelter operations training, and what happens during a declared health emergency. What's another thing? There's a whole different group that's involved when it becomes a health emergency versus some sort of a natural disaster. Some of our future trainings, we are going to be developing a CERT team, so we're looking at that. Also doing some direct volunteer training with our faith-based groups, because many of them are signed up to be shelters. So they need to have that volunteer base that's ready to operate that shelter, because in Missouri, Red Cross no longer operates the shelters. It's up to whatever group is serving as that shelter. So those are some of the things that we'll be looking at in the future. And as I said, it's not uncommon to back in from a long-term recovery committee to a COAD, but if you can get those players in place during Blue Sky times, it's a whole lot easier to go from a COAD to developing that long-term recovery committee. So, Mike, I will send it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Bev. I appreciate that. I've got a little bit different story to tell. It started out to be the same story you just heard twice, a single county COAD. Washington State University's main campus in Pullman is located in Whitman County, Washington, and we've just completed a long process of creating a joint comprehensive emergency management plan, city, county, and university. That's a culmination of about 5 years of learning to work well together and doing quite a bit of combined activity around emergency management and emergency response. And when we found out about this project, our thought was that we would use the COAD development process in Whitman County to bring on a new group of players in all phases of emergency management that would serve as the multiplier effect for relatively scarce resources in the three big players. And we started that way, and our ringleader, the person who took primary responsibility, was out of Whitman County Emergency Management. And very quickly she discovered that there was other interest and that there were existing cross-county and cross-border initiatives that made sense, and extended the offer to other counties in both Washington and Idaho to participate. Ultimately, we ended up with 9 counties, 4 in Washington, 5 in Idaho, and the Nez Perce tribe in Idaho. So 10 participants total in what we've called the Palouse-Clearwater VOAD, Palouse being the Washington side of the border and Clearwater the Idaho side of the border. And we settled on volunteer organizations active in disaster rather than community, in part because of the regional scope of this operation, 9 counties and a tribal reservation. In part because Idaho is fixed on the VOAD label rather than COAD, and in part because the Nez Perce tribe in particular was in favor of a volunteer organization rather than a community organization label for the activity. That caused us a little bit of let's just call it opportunity to coordinate with the Washington State VOAD, but we crossed that hurdle late fall last year. This all started in early 2015, ultimately culminated in an approved set of bylaws signed in October of last year. So relatively new organization, but taking advantage of the fact that there are already linkages across these counties in a number of endeavors: mutual aid agreements for fire, support agreements for emergency management, quad cities and bigger task forces for law enforcement, those sorts of things. So the official players are all reasonably familiar with each other, and that was a great start for this activity. The counties are remarkably similar in terms of geography, size, and demographics. None of the 9 counties has more than 100,000 in population. There's no town larger than 40,000 in any of the counties, and pretty large geographically. Whitman County, our county, for instance, is 2,500 square miles with about 53,000 people. And most of those people are represented at WSU and the city of Pullman, where we're located. So most of the emergency management operations at the county and city level are very small operations, familiar tune from across the country. And everybody was interested in formalizing the relationship with other participants, with a formal emphasis on all hazards, but really a strong preference for getting ready for long-term recovery. We think that that's probably where the most play comes in for the volunteer organizations active in disaster. The PC VOAD, Police Clearwater VOAD, has reached out to some of the usual suspects, the Red Cross, the faith-based organizations, but has also benefited from membership from service organizations, Rotary, Elks, Eagles, Elk, Moose, those sorts of organizations. And it varies a bit from county to county. We actually think that from the perspective of a regional organization, that's a good thing, because we have a pretty diverse participant base, and that gives us a great wealth of both perspective and experience, and makes it less likely that we'll suffer a critical loss from participants impacted by a particular disaster. And so we think that there's some strength in that model, and I think that's one of the things that we can contribute to this growing set of documents and materials on how to form these COADs and VOADs. We had a great experience with that. Great as in meaningful, powerful, and contributing to learning. Not so great in that it was one of the largest wildfires in North Idaho last year that hit Clearwater County. And so we're able to apply the benefits of having a regional VOAD and bring resources to bear immediately in terms of how to handle donations using an existing organization in Clearwater County. Because it's 9 counties, 1 tribe, and 2 states, we do not have 501c3 for the organization. The model is to rely on organizations that already have that status in each of the participating counties and jurisdictions. So in the Clearwater County case with the fires last fall, it used an existing faith-based 501c3 to handle cash donations, brought in resources from other counties under the umbrella of the VOAD, and assisted significantly in terms of donations, sheltering, and are still very active in terms of long-term recovery from the fires. So a great learning experience for us, a great confirmation that a regional VOAD has great power and is the right thing for us to be doing. We've crafted a nice group of participating organizations and individuals. Leadership has transitioned from, initially it was the Whitman County Emergency Management Office, to now the Regional Red Cross actually is the leading entity, and one of their members is the executive director for the VOAD. Most recent example of our activities and what this means is that 2 weeks ago, our vet school here at Washington University hosted an Animals in Disaster tabletop workshop based around an exercise scenario, and we had 32 participants from across the region attend that conference. Again, a great demonstration of the value of having that widespread and diverse a group participating, because any one of the counties or any county organization would rapidly be overtaken and their resources exhausted by any sort of significant event. The fact that we've got that breadth to draw on really gives more power to the organization and makes it more valuable for the first responder organizations. We've got great participation from the emergency management organizations in each county, and from health in several of the counties. So we're anxious to keep this going, and are refining our materials to allow them to serve as a model for how other jurisdictions might look at a regional model, a multi-county, multi-city model rather than single. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to Bev to talk a little bit about what we learned.
Okay, Mike, I think you're doing the next couple slides before you turn it back to me.
Yeah, I was just testing. Thanks. I appreciate that. You're right. I was so sure I was through talking that I was through talking. So let's talk a little bit about successes. So we've got successful formation of COADs, or in our case, what we're calling the VOAD, in all 4 states. Those experiences have benefit at the local level. So in one respect, we could simply say that this pilot project has achieved success because we have those organizations in place and active, and actually helping to respond to events in those states. But more than that, beyond the local level, we've got the lessons learned from the formation of those organizations. We've got a nice set of varied documentation, because each of the states took a slightly different approach. And because of that, we've got different formats for the process, different formats for membership, different formats for documentation, and a nice smorgasbord of materials available for people who want to know more about how to go about doing this in their jurisdiction. That same multiple level benefit applies when we look at new partnerships. In our case, in Washington, we crafted some new partnerships across state lines, across county lines, across organizational lines that strengthen all of us and make us better able to plan for, prepare for, respond to, and especially recover from significant events. We've got way more resources available than we used to have because of those partnerships. At the Eden level, we've got this nice 4-state partnership now. The group of us that you've heard from, with the exception of one today in this webinar, who have done really interesting work together, figured out how to do that effectively at long distance with the benefit of very few in-person meetings, and who will continue to work together on this activity and to support the Eden work group on community and economic development. So great partnership there, internal to Eden, in addition to the local partnerships. And then finally, I think this has made Eden more visible and given us capability and interest in participating in other partnerships at the national level. So how might Eden play with Department of Homeland Security, for instance, in helping build community resilience through formation of COADs and VOADs. So great experience with new partnerships, as well as the successful formation of these individual entities. And it's opened up doors for additional programming opportunities, again, at the Eden level. We'll be sharing these products and benefits at the Eden Conference coming up in October. We've shared this at the Extension National Association of Community Development Extension Professionals Conference most recently. Actually, this team won a national award for teamwork, not to toot our own horn on that one, but a recognition that the rest of the Extension community recognizes the value of this work. And so that opens up additional opportunities for training and for working with other extension professionals. And finally, at the local level, what I'm getting is much more attention to this dynamic. How does extension play in the process of empowering communities to be better prepared for and then ultimately to recover from significant negative events? So lots of successes, specific and general, at all levels of geographic aggregation. That's one of the exciting things for me of having been a participant in this process. Next slide. Thanks, Beth. So as you might imagine, with any particularly volunteer-based activity, there have been some challenges. For us, the participants, this was an other duty as taken on, not assigned, but we volunteered for this, and that meant some time challenges for us in getting organized, working with our partners, coming back together as a team. We worked through those in the ways that you might imagine if you've done any of this kind of work. And sometimes that meant prioritizing, sometimes that meant sacrificing. What it means is that our experience is probably ubiquitous for anybody that wants to engage in this. You have to find the time, you have to have interest, if not passion for it, or it won't be a priority for you. The same is true for local participants. This is other activity in addition to their daily lives for all of the folks who might represent their entities in participating in a COAD or VOAD. And one of the first challenges is making sure that it's clear to them that participating is worth their time, that there is value to them and value to their communities for their participation so that they can prioritize that time. Not everybody got that message at the same level for us, and I think that's probably true for the other folks on this panel. That we have some folks who are a part of the STP group that is common for volunteer organizations, right? The same 10 people end up doing all the work. And so we've got our STP group here in the PC VOAD experience. We've got some folks who are frequent flyers and some folks who are infrequent flyers, and that's just the way these organizations work. The challenge is to offer value and opportunity for folks to participate at whatever level works for them, so that when something does happen, they are familiar with the organization, they are a participating part of the organization, and they can plug in and offer value, even if their participation has been limited. Part of the response to that challenge is finding activities for them, right? Not just coming to meetings, but activities that have value for these participants that help refresh their commitment to the organization and keep them participating on a sustainable level long term. For us, it's been things like this tabletop workshop that the vet school hosted, offering training. So we've hosted ICS training, general and specific topics, ICS training across the region. And that's one of the nice things about having a regional approach, is that no one jurisdiction might have the horsepower to organize an ICS specific topic training and get enough participants. But drawing from this PC VOAD, we were able to draw enough folks to have critical mass for that kind of training. And then we have regular meetings and try to provide information that they might not otherwise have access to, and materials that they can take home and use in other adventures, other avenues. Again, the idea is to find something of value that every participant can identify that will keep them participating in the activity when there is no emergency going on. Participation when there's an emergency is relatively easy. The challenge is maintaining commitment and activity when we're in, as Bev has said, blue sky times. And now I think actually it's time for me to turn it over to Bev.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so the question is, so what? Well, we found and we feel that we have proven that the COAD model does really work and that it is repeatable. So, that's the good news about it. It can be done, and it can work in a variety of figurations. Each one of us have done something slightly different in the organizational part of that COAD development. So it's a model that will work for anyone who's interested in putting that together. We've also found that COADs do help improve response time and effectiveness. And Brendan Ashley Mueller in Nebraska are testimony to that. The COAD in the county where Grand Island is had been formed about 3 to 4 months when they had a major flood, and that group was on the ground and ready to go. So they felt so good that their COAD was ready and that they had those partnerships in place. And it did definitely reduce the response time for their COAD. Another thing, Extension can be a very strong leader in developing the COADs along with your emergency management director. And again, I can't stress that strong enough. You have to have that EMD on board or it's not going to happen. If they don't put value in what you're doing and recognize that the COAD is a tool for them to hand off some recovery things, that is so critical. Spend time developing the relationship with that emergency management director first. We believe that Extension is the right agency to facilitate the development of the COADs. Again, we have those offices in each of the counties for the most part, so we're there. One caution I would give you is do not allow the group to put you in as chair, because that changes your role with the group. Try to stay as a facilitator, possibly as a secretary early on. I did that with our COAD just because I wanted to make sure that we got everything documented as it needed to be and all the I's dotted and T's crossed. So possibly secretary as far as in those early stages, but try to avoid letting them put you in as chair, because that will change your role with them. Okay, next slide. This is a quote from Brent, and he was just really taken by the fact that Extension was willing to step up and help get things going. Brent and Ashley hit it off perfect. They are working together like crazy. They hit the ground running as soon as we had our organizational meeting, went through how to put the COADs together, and they are actively forming additional COADs on the local level across Nebraska. So we're really seeing a team that has developed and that is working to move that across the state and get things going there in Nebraska. So we're really happy about that. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Carrie now.
Yeah, thanks, Bev. And so for those of you who are listening in today and those who might want to consider doing this particular project or try to replicate or develop a COAD in your area, what we've done as a result of this pilot project is design an 8-step process, and that is available on the Eden website under the COAD, and hopefully somebody got the correct URL in the website. I tried to put it in, or in the chat box, and you can go to the Eden website, and under each step we've uploaded some materials, or Abby has uploaded some materials to help you go through this process, and we will continue to add stuff as our COADs develop more and more materials, and our exercises and trainings become a little richer. We'll continue to add things to that website. so that those of you who would like to try this or are thinking about trying this can download information to help guide your process along the way. And I think at this point we can open it up for questions. I think the next slide has a survey link in it. We've got some chats here. Let me take a look at that. Let's see, here we at. Beth, can you kind of jump in here okay, so if you go to the chat pod for the survey link, if you fill out that survey, then I believe you can go to the Q&A site and ask any questions. Mike and Bev, you want to kind of hop on here and...
Sure, we're going to give everybody just a minute or two to complete the survey, and then we'll come right back and follow that with any questions that you might have. So if you would just click on that link in chat for the survey and go through that real quick, that'll help us to improve presentations and future webinars.
Could everyone begin to drop "I'm finished with the survey" into the chat pod as soon as you're finished, and we will have a good feeling for who is done and when we should go on.
Thanks, Abby. Three down. Four.
Hey guys, can you hear me? It's Steve.
Yes, we can.
I unmuted my mic. Because of the structure, the way this was set up, I can't send my question in, but someone mentioned that their COAD is starting a citizen corps. I often get the question, what's the difference between a COAD and a citizen corps? Do any of you want to talk about that?
I can talk about it a little bit if you'd like.
Great.
Okay. Basically, your COAD is in response to an event that has happened. When you're setting up a CERT team or citizen corps, as Steve mentioned, this is a group that works together. They sometimes do response and get active during the response and recovery stage, both. We have a CERT team in one of our communities here, and they do a lot of community activities just to build that bond and that cooperation and that working together effort. I know a lot of times whenever there's a large community event, they will be there. They may be directing traffic, they may be servicing a first aid station, but they are much more active during a disaster, whereas a COAD is only active pretty much following the disaster, working with those people who have fallen through the cracks or who are in need of specific things. We oftentimes have case managers who are trained to work one-on-one with people, and that's a whole nother webinar that we can do. But those disaster case managers work under the local COAD. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea as to the difference between a COAD or VOAD and a CERT team.
If I can jump in, Steve, on our side, because we've adopted an all hazards approach for the PC VOAD, our folks are often a little bit more active during the event. Their primary focus, again, is long-term recovery, but even if they're active during the event, their focus is not what in ICS terms would be operational, right? So a CERT team might actually get involved in light search and rescue or triage, to name a couple of the topics that CERT teams are trained in. That would be an operational function for incident response. Our VOAD folks might be active, but they'd be doing things like donation and donation management and distribution, less operational than maybe logistics in terms of ICS terms. Sometimes that can be a subtle distinction, but for the most part, our thinking is that the VOAD folks will be a bit standoff and not directly engaged in incident response.
Good description. I always tell my COADs that the most important thing they can learn by doing some of the ICS training is to learn how to stay out of the way. Because the VOAD COAD people are not responders. They don't do the recovery type, the actual during the incident. Okay, I think maybe we have the surveys done, so maybe we're ready to move on to the next slide and take questions.
There is a question on the chat site that says that HC825 works in an urban coastal community, and there is a city of office emergency management. Would developing a COAD be helpful here, or at least collaborate and developing a partnership with the office? And I think I can speak for Mike, Bev, Ashley, and I that we think developing a COAD anywhere would be great. The key to that is if you go through that step-by-step process that's on the website, first and foremost, get with the emergency manager, whether it be in that community or the county. Make sure there's not already a COAD in existence, and then sort of work through where are there gaps, work through that process. And I think definitely a coastal community, since most of us that we're speaking today, we have riverine flooding, which is much less frequent probably than coastal issues, but absolutely a community can have a COAD, but because of the geographic nature of most institutions that are involved in a COAD, you may want to consider doing the whole county. Bev or Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll step in. I don't think I said during the introduction that I wear another of my hats is actually emergency management director for the university. And I work pretty actively with the State Emergency Managers Association and our National Guard Bureau that covers emergency management for the state. There's an occupational hazard that goes along with being a professional emergency manager, and that is a distrust of uncoordinated volunteer activities. At the individual level, we call them spontaneous, undocumented local volunteers, and our inclination is get them the hell away from our disasters. And the same is true to an extent for any level of volunteer activity in response to support for response or recovery from an emergency or a disaster. So to the extent that you can form a COAD and engage with the local emergency management office, you've solved that dilemma. And here's the dilemma from my perspective. While there's a natural inclination to distrust organizations or individuals with whom you have not worked before when they're trying to intrude on your disaster, you need their help. and that help can be critical to effective response and especially to effective recovery. So forming a COAD deals with that two-edged sword, right? You become familiar to and with the emergency manager. They see your organization and the organizations that participate in your COAD as assets rather than nuisances, and you provide that multiplier effect, which improves response, adds capacity. All of those things the emergency manager ought to appreciate if they are sprung on him or her before the event rather than during.
I'll throw out a comment too. Our city and county emergency management directors actually help determine the trainings that we do in our COAD, and they conduct some of those trainings. So again, that strengthens that bond and reinforces that connection between your emergency management directors and your COAD. So if they are actually delivering some of those quarterly trainings, that helps them to develop the resources they need and to get to know the people that they can call on and that they can depend on for that. Other questions?
And Steve brought up a really good point. We have a lot of resources within Extension that we can bring to bear on the formation of these COADs and actually training and assistance in the annexes. As I alluded to as I was talking about Henderson County, we actually decided that it would be nice to have an education and training committee or annex, and so we sort of created one. And through that, we actually serve with Extension as once people say that they want a training on a certain topic, we go out and try to find those topics and the people to get involved. For instance, when we did our tabletop, we made sure we had the fair board, and we talked about especially our ag annex coming into bear and educating people on the fair board what actually happens in a disaster. Most of us that serve really rural areas understand that rural areas have a tendency to be heavily ag-oriented and also resilient. So the response was, hey, we'll just come in. As soon as the storm hits, there'll be people here with their trailers and picking up their own animals. And that was a really nice teachable moment to say, in the event of a disaster like this, you're not going to be allowed to come in with your trailer and pick up your animals. So making sure that you have that ag annex in place in rural areas is critical, because we've brought in the Farm Bureau, which people look to, as well as Extension in terms of the agriculture community. And it's really helpful that people know that beforehand, because we know in a disaster, emotions are high, everybody's stressed out. So having that knowledge and recognition before a disaster is crucial, and especially with rural populations that are used to being incredibly resilient. So I hope that addresses your question, Steve, on how we're trying to bring those in. And I know rural areas in Illinois differ greatly from rural areas in Idaho and Washington. So I'm thinking that they have special challenges with forestry issues and those kind of things that we have with livestock and commodity agriculture as well.
We have a couple of questions that have come into the chat box. One is, how are you encouraging your COADs to work with a national VOAD system and state VOADs? I think that probably depends a little bit on the structure in your state. In Missouri, our local COADs work directly with the state COAD VOAD. They don't really get involved at the national level, but in that chain of command, they do work directly with our state. In fact, our state COAD representative often attends our quarterly meetings and sometimes even has participated with some of the trainings. I think I hope that answers that question. We had a second question about COADs and CERT teams in small counties being the same. I think there are two different functions there. Mike, do you want to pick that one up and maybe talk a little bit more about the difference between a cert and a COAD?
Sure. So back to my first comments on this. So I've been on a CERT team and I've trained CERT teams, and you know, the idea behind CERT training is first to convert the individuals who get the training from being victims and users of resources to being self-sufficient, and then second to form them into teams that serve as force multipliers or augmentees for the official response. And as such, in a disaster, we would anticipate using CERT teams as components of the operational response, right? Directing traffic, light search and rescue, light medical support, running shelters, very much on the operational side of incident response at the incident command level. And I see our VOAD, COAD folks as operating really at, if you will, the EOC level rather than the incident command level. They are supporting response and organizing support for response, but not actually doing response. And so donation management is one of the first things that comes to mind, right? Donations really don't play into incident response. They're in short-term and long-term recovery rather than incident response. You know, there may be a role for that long-term recovery committee management in VOADs and COADs. Individual COADs or VOADs might find that they are playing a closer support role, right? So they might do, for instance, coordination of volunteers. So they might be in either, again, to use the ICS terminology, either logistics or planning function, right? So I can see using COAD members, for instance, to document and do intake on volunteers. In fact, I guess it's conceivable that a COAD group could intake a CERT group and put them to work through the ICS system. But I really see that as the distinction, that the COAD, VOAD groups are parent organizations, each of them, which may have volunteers who would be interested in working in disaster response. But those volunteers would ultimately, at least in Washington and Idaho, have to be documented as volunteers and operating under the authority of local emergency management. They wouldn't be operating under color of the volunteer organizations in a response capacity. That's the beauty of the CERT team, is that they are under color and authority of the local emergency management. They're already slotted into that response capacity. So it's a question of direct or indirect participation in the incident or emergency, and at what level they operate. CERT teams can be pretty street level, actually engaged in immediate response, doing operational level stuff, working sometimes in coordination with fire and police, for instance. And I see COADs really in a support function, as removed from the actual response, maybe complementing response with things like shelter management or volunteer or donation management, but really one or two levels above that operational incident response, operating, again, in my thinking, using the ICS terminology, closer to an EOC interface than an IC interface for disaster response and support. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I see we're just about out of time, so let's go to the next slide. We need to do a little bit of a wrap up here. Okay. This has been a part of the extension, e-extension learning opportunity for this particular COAD. It has been recorded, so you'll see a bar at the bottom that shows you where that recording will be found. It should be available in a couple days, so if you have coworkers who'd like to hear this or you think it would benefit them, please share that with them. And next slide. And we also want to encourage you to check out the Eden site. We do have information on there. It's eden.lsu.edu, and as was put in the chat, we now have that COAD page up, thanks to Abby. Yay, Abby. So it's available for you to look at too, and we'll be continually adding to that, as Carrie mentioned. Next slide. Okay, and E-Extension has a variety of topics that every second Tuesday you can set in on, so check out those topics and see if there's one that you might be interested in. Extension.org.disasters is one area of E-Extension that those of us in Eden also work with. So that being said, thanks for joining everybody, and we hope you have a good day. Beth, if you have anything to say to wrap up, why, otherwise we will say sign off and say have a great one.